very concerned that our society is much more interested in information than wonder, in noise rather than silence.
Fred Rogers, whose loving, prophetic voice is most known in his role as Mr. Rogers on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, observes in 1994 what is even more true today: information and noise. And he wonders,
how do we encourage reflection?
Jesus asks this too. Jesus says he came that we might have life more abundantly, and invites us to pay attention and have the wonder and silence and eyes to see, that we might not miss what's really in us and around us, this abundant life that Jesus comes to share. But,
oh my, this is a noisy world.
This is still a noisy world. At Salt House this fall, we come together to make space in the noise for prayer and breath to reflect. Our journey is led by another prophet, Cole Arthur Riley, who dares to ask in her new book, This Here Flesh, how can spirituality not silence the body, but instead allow it to come alive? How can we find peace in a world overtaken with dislocation, noise, and unrest? Cole Arthur Riley is a contemplative, the kind of contemplation everyone can do. Contemplation that is a bridge between our interior and exterior worlds, fully experiencing our bodies, present where we are, and seeing our world and reality as they truly are. The current moment and the last few years have not felt like life and abundance. It has been hard to know what we feel and see and make sense of it all. So each Sunday this fall, we become contemplatives as we open ourselves to the Jesus story and a chapter or two from This Here Flesh. Each one names a theme, a way we come alive, including body, place, belonging, fear, wonder, rage, memory, lament, and liberation. So friends, this fall, do you want to come alive into the abundant life of God that is within you and all around you? Me too. What a gift that we get to contemplate and grow together as we explore ways we come alive.
I will never forget the morning of November 18th. It was the Sunday before Thanksgiving. I woke up in my childhood bedroom. I'd only moved home a few weeks earlier after living abroad for 3 years. And I got out of bed. I put on a yellow t-shirt. It was from the American Hiking Society, and it said, "Find your happy place" on it. I put on pajama pants that were navy and yellow plaid with the logo of my alma mater on the hip. I went downstairs and made a mango smoothie. I put papaya in it because these smoothies were like the only way I was clinging to those flavors from my exotic life abroad. My mom was watching Sunday Morning with Jane Pauley on CBS. They were doing this bit on balsamic vinegar and how to be true balsamic, it has to come from the specific region in Italy and be aged for 25 years in a barrel. And we mused that morning that I was 25 years old. My mom speculated that Dad probably wouldn't go to church. There was a baptism and a guest preacher, and both of those things normally meant Dad didn't go to church. But I told her I'd go. I just needed to shave and splash some water in my curls. I went to the bathroom and I turned on the sink. And no sooner had I done so that my mom came and knocked on the door. And as she did, she said words that just shattered everything. "Zach, I think Dad's dead." And I remember looking up and making eye contact with myself in the mirror and saying, "No, not dead." And I remember grabbing the doorknob and turning the corner into my parents' room, and there was Dad. His eyes were closed, his body was cold, and his clenched fist was the only sign of the heart attack he had somewhere in the middle of the night. November 18th was the worst day of my life. And this sermon has scared me to write. It scares me even more now to be delivering it, because I don't want to go back to November 18th. And I imagine that many of us have had this experience. Many of us have had that worst day of our lives when someone we loved died. Maybe even more than someone has died in your life. I mean, many of us have many love-shaped holes in our hearts. So I invite you to think of who this is for you. And perhaps, again, maybe it's more than one person you've lost. Perhaps a mother or a father, a sibling, a child, a parent or grandparent, perhaps an aunt, an uncle, or a cousin, or a friend, or a mentor. Let's just take a breath and bring those loved ones that we have lost to mind. Because today is All Saints' Day. Lutheran theology defines a saint as a forgiven sinner. Luther said we are simultaneously saints and sinners. So on this day, we celebrate those forgiven sinners who are no longer with us in the flesh. And as much as I don't want to go back to November 18th, today is the day when we do just that. Today, as you think of the saints you've loved, today is again their funeral. And perhaps this is shocking to you. Perhaps you didn't expect to go to a funeral today. Perhaps like me, you don't want to. But the wisdom of the church calendar as we come to the end of the year knows that we must pause and we must go back. We must remember. Because if we don't, we might be tempted to avoid that hurt. We might be tempted to move on with life. We might be tempted to never revisit November 18th. But that's not how life and love and loss work. We must remember, because death ends a life, not a relationship. And those loves we've lost live on in our memories. And memory is also a theme that Cole Arthur Riley uses in her book, This Here Flesh. So as you think about your saints, we're going to consider, as this next piece of our series, how we come alive through memory. And there are obvious ways that memory helps us come alive. Memory preserves stories. I'm sure if you have a family, and many of you do, you know something about preserving stories. Are there stories from your family that you hear every single time you get together? Stories of that time that your uncle crashed the car, or stories of when the family moved, or stories of how your grandparents met, maybe stories of that embarrassing thing your parents did as a kid, or stories of the first time that that one relative met the family. But memories aren't just stories that we tell. Some memories we can taste. Are there foods that your family always makes when you get together? Are there secret family recipes that Google just can't quite get right? Are there foods that you miss from years and years ago, or smells that take you back to the kitchen? And some memories we can see. Do you have home movies to watch, or photos in a shoebox somewhere? I realize someday you're going to be saying like photos on a Facebook wall somewhere, and it's just not going to land quite the same way. Well, my dad did all of these things. My dad was quite the storyteller. If I've heard it once, I've heard it 100 times, that he was born at home in the kitchen in Reading, Pennsylvania. He went to school in a one-room Amish schoolhouse. He and his friends would go hunting for squirrels and rabbits in their free time. They moved to Denver when my dad was 10, and he actually held a college swimming record in Colorado for a little while. He was drafted for Vietnam, but he never went because of a stomach ulcer. And it was a stomach ulcer that he later blamed on a girl that broke his heart. He worked for Disney in his 20s. He owned a restaurant where he met my mom. He and his brother later took over the family HVAC business. And he wasn't as naturally talented with his hands as his brother, but over the years, he became quite a craftsman. He actually told me just days before he died how proud he was of the many things he taught himself to fix and do. And food. My dad was a cook, and he didn't cook most days, but when he did, it was decadent. If he made breakfast, it was an omelet. If he made dinner, it was an appetizer of bacon-wrapped scallops and cream sauce, followed by a bowl of homemade clam chowder, and then prime rib with king crab legs, and dessert was honeycomb pudding, which was the secret family recipe. Surprisingly, Dad didn't pack lunches. And Dad was a videographer. He had one of those big over-the-shoulder cameras that recorded onto VHS tapes. We have videotape after videotape of Christmas Day that he filmed. Like, there is literally 30-some hours of my brother and I opening every single stocking stuffer we received in like the first 10 years of our lives. There are also hours of clips with relatives being like, all right, Terry, that's enough. And when cameras came out on phones, like the number of bad double chin selfies that my dad had on his phone, I'll never unsee it. But my dad preserved memories. And these memories, these stories and recipes and images, They make us who we are. They tether us to the people we love and the people we come from. They take us back in time to origins before we were born. In her book, Cole says, without memory, we are forced to rely solely on ideas and suggestions to make sense of who we are, as opposed to the concrete. So do you have memories of your saints like this? The people of God know how important it is to remember. There is a refrain across Scripture to remember where we have been, remember what our ancestors have been through, remember what God has done for us. I think one of the best examples of this is with the Israelites. After God frees them from slavery in Egypt, they're wandering through the wilderness on their way to the Promised Land. And at one point, while Moses is off getting the commandments, they build a golden calf, or a golden idol, which angers God. Do you remember this story? And so then they're forced to wander around for 40 years before they can enter the Promised Land. And this story is found in the Bible a couple of times. We have it in Exodus and Numbers, and then in Deuteronomy, we basically get it again, where we're now at the end of that 40 years, with a whole new generation of Israelites just dying to get into the Promised Land. And Moses sits everyone down and tells them the stories of their ancestors. And in Deuteronomy 9, which is referenced on your bulletin, Moses starts by telling the story of this golden calf idol. And I just have to imagine if you were a 20-something Israelite born in the wilderness, you'd be like, Uncle Moses, if I have to hear this story one more time. But that's kind of how we think, right? I mean, it's how I think. But memory is important. The tradition of storytelling pervades the identity of the people of God. This starts a tradition of saying, but you weren't there. You don't understand. You must remember. And this tradition gets handed down to us because we need it. And my little bleeding heart loves this. Because while memory preserves stories, the second thing memory does is connect us to justice. Like, consider the reckoning we've had as a society these past few years around our collective memory, around our history. We've recognized how our nation's history has been written by white, straight, able-bodied male voices, and that some of that history has been biased and edited. For example, history has been far kinder in remembering the poetic speeches of Martin Luther King than it has the black men and women that built the country. Queer figures in history have often been reduced to speculation because their identities were so hidden or erased. Disabled folks are often remembered for overcoming obstacles, but not for their poetry or art or politics or literature. And Indigenous history is hardly remembered at all. Carl Arthur Riley puts it like this. She says, memory is meant to be given. It isn't held well alone. It is meant to be held in a collective and across generations. Memories that remain exclusive to a particular individual or even community are at risk of becoming false. When memory endures no scrutiny or curiosity or challenge from the exterior, it can lead to a profound loneliness at best, at worst, individual or collective delusion. I think about this again with Moses. There are several obscure passages in Deuteronomy, there are a lot of them, where Moses is talking about a few random commandments, and he ties them back to memory. So a couple examples in Deuteronomy 24, Moses says, leave behind some crops for the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow. Leave behind some olives for the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow. Leave behind some grapes for the immigrant, the orphan, and the widow. They're not exactly the thou shalt not commandments we're used to. But the refrain of why we do these things is to remember. He says, remember, you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Remember, you have been the marginalized and the oppressed. You have to remember your story. Remember your own suffering. Remember what it was like. Because the people of God know that if you forget your history, you might be doomed to repeat it. You might create the same injustices that your ancestors fought to escape. To remember is an act of justice. And while this is true on a societal and social justice level, it's also true for you and for your saints. Because some memories aren't recorded. Some memories can't be so easily recreated. And some memories died with the saints that we remember today. I can think of one for my dad. My dad was involved in all of my extracurriculars. Like he chaperoned the school overnight trip to the mountains, and he coached my Brain Bowl trivia team, and he was so involved in my Boy Scout troop. And so the particular time I'm thinking of was a trip to Boy Scout camp. I was probably 11 or 12, and it was my second year going to camp. The first year had not been a success. So my dad signed up to go with me that second year, and we drove from Denver to the Tetons in Idaho. I remember so many things about that trip. My dad was one of 2 adults to complete the mile swim across the lake, and he finished second. I remember every night they had the biggest bonfire with elaborate shows that had flaming arrows and mysterious performers that arrived in canoes. And I don't remember what the other kids were doing on this particular day, but sometime in the middle of the week, my dad and I went off on our own, and we went hiking. And we weren't really following a trail, we just kind of snaked out into the meadow. And at some point we sat on the ground, and when I sat down, the grass was almost as tall as I was. And I don't remember exactly what we were talking about when we saw it, but at some point my dad stopped and whispered, "Look over there. Do you see that bird?" And walking through the grass, bobbing its head with every step, was this giant, sand-colored, red-headed crane. And when my dad saw it, time froze, and we sat together in silence, just the 2 of us, taking in the mystery of this encounter with this magical beast. And no one else was there. It was just my dad and I. No one holds that memory. Do you have these memories? Are there magical moments you shared with people who are now gone? Are there sacred stories that you are now the sole bearer of? Do you feel that? Do you feel how remembering makes us come alive? Do you feel something stir inside of you? Do you feel how holy your own memories are? Well, there's one more important thing that memory does. Memory makes sense of our pain. As many of you know, I've been interning at Harborview Medical Center in the spiritual care department. And as a chaplain, we sit with a lot of families who have just lost their saints. If you're unfamiliar, Harborview is the level 1 trauma center for Washington, Alaska, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. And trauma is defined as something that overwhelms your existing capacity to cope. So in the moments of our most overwhelming grief, our brains literally forget how to process or form memories. Our brains are flung into chaos, and we can't find the words, and nothing makes sense. Like, that's how my brain was on November 18th when I said out loud, "No, not dead. It doesn't make sense." But what we're finding in neuro research is that storytelling brings the chaos of our brains back into order. Storytelling retrains our brains to access memories and start forming new ones. There's nothing that we can say to make the hurt stop. There is no comfort for a grieving, broken heart. But we can tell stories, and we can remember. The people of God have also often had traditions around creating rituals to provoke memory and storytelling. At the end of Deuteronomy, the Israelites finally crossed the River Jordan into the Promised Land. And in the next book, we meet Joshua, who takes over for Moses. And Joshua does something to remember the journey. He has the people place these large stones in the river so that their children will see the stones and will ask what they are for. The parents will then remember and tell the story to their children. And a little later on, when early Israel is building a society, they're kind of putting together this system of tribal chiefs and judges, and one of their leaders is named Samuel. And he does this thing where after this big battle where tons of people are slaughtered, he sets out a stone that he calls Ebenezer. And it's a reminder to everyone of what happened. And over, we could keep going in the scriptures. There's this need to ritually create physical reminders for storytelling and memory. These rocks that make people go, wait, what happened here? Who were these people? What were their stories? What ancestors and memories died in this place? But we don't have rituals like that in our culture. We don't give ourselves reminders to pause and remember and grieve. And I think it's because there's this societal fear that comes with memory. And it basically goes something like this. If I start to remember, I might get lost in the emotion of remembering. Or to put it plainly, if I start remembering, I might get sad. And in our culture, which prizes a pursuit of happiness, there's nothing worse than being sad. And that's why I hate November 18th. I don't want to be reminded of that hole in my heart. I don't want to feel the sadness again. But the sadness of memory is part of coming alive too. Because the sadness we feel in grief is the absence of love. We feel great hurt because we knew great love. Cole Arthur Riley puts it like this. She says, liberation cannot be found by tearing holes into oneself. People say in heaven we won't remember any of the sorrow anymore. I hope they're wrong. It would be a disingenuous eternity to exist without all that has made me. I hope when God brings heaven down, they bring with them the storytelling circles of old, that we would all gather around the fire, listening to the ancestors, singing familiar songs. I don't want to make it to the promised land if it means I have to forget the wilderness. So the wisdom of the church calendar, as we come to the end of the year, knows that we must pause and we must remember, because death ends a life, not a relationship. I don't know what happens after we die. I so wish that I did. I mean, The Good Place, that TV show with Kristen Bell and Ted Danson, it said that heaven is having more time with the ones we love. Some traditions imagine us flying away on angels' wings. Some traditions picture meadows or banquets or huge houses where we feast and dine and live together. Some traditions promise that everything will finally make sense. But whatever it looks like, there has to be chocolate. And I hope it's all true, all of it. But what I know is true for sure is that in the tears and the hurt and the unrelenting, gut-wrenching pain of grief, God is there. And I know this is true because we see it on the cross. When given the option to avoid suffering, Jesus walks straight into it. When given the option to skip pain and grief, Jesus chooses to stay. And just like the cross is the path forward to new life, the grief and the hurt our memories stir, this very act of remembering keeps our saints alive and with us too. And Jesus walks straight in and stays with us and comforts us in that heartache too. On many occasions at Harborview, I've said, I lost my dad too. Tell me about yours. And what I've learned in a level 1 trauma center is that when we go into our memories, when we relive the joys and the hurts and the unspoken things, when we relive the love and the pain, God cuddles up right next to us and holds us, and he relives it too. And when I step into my grief and I tell stories about my dad is with me. And November 18th hurts just a little bit less. So now, as the people of God on this All Saints Sunday, we want to engage in our own ritual of remembering. We want to say the names of our collective saints out loud. And so there are 2 ways you're invited to do that. First, we're going to name our saints aloud in worship today. And to do that, you have a piece of paper or a couple pieces of paper, or any paper will do. If you need one, you can wave and we'll get you paper. And on this, you can write down the names of your saints. During our songs, you can take a moment to write and then hold them up, and we'll come around and grab them so they can be read aloud during our prayers. And if you'd like to speak the name of your own saint, in a moment, Pastor Sarah will invite people forward to do that as well. So you can write it for us to read, or you can come forward and speak the name yourself. Either way, we want to hear the name of your saint. And then second, we want to add your saint to our tree over here. Our saints are those whose memory helps us continue to come alive. So you're invited to remember your saints by writing their names on a strip of cloth and then tying it to the tree. And folks online, instead of putting names in comments, go to the bulletin link, and there's a place to submit names of saints there, and we will read those and make sure they get added to our tree as well. So in closing, in the Jewish tradition, when someone dies, there's a traditional blessing of blessed be their memory, or may their memory be a blessing. So I'd like to offer that to you today. May your memories help you come alive. May your memories bring tears and smiles to remind you that God is close to the brokenhearted. And may your memories of those you have loved and lost bless you. Amen? Amen.